Hello everyone, John AG here. Welcome back to my channel, Aurex. If you haven't yet, subscribe to my channel. In this channel, you will find the real information, the real market updates that everyone else cannot and will not tell you. So please subscribe to this channel, and I love you all, my subscribers, for your relentless support. And please, watch this video till the very end because YouTube will not push my videos to more people. The algorithms are designed to suppress this kind of truth, to keep the masses pacified while the elites position themselves for the fallout. We are relying entirely on your watch time to break through the silence. I am bringing you this information today because I want to make this speech fully professional, emotionally resonant, and equipped with a powerful human touch that cuts through the noise of the mainstream financial media. Today is May 8th, 2026. I want you to mark this date in your minds. I want you to remember where you were when you finally understood the magnitude of the illusion we have all been living under. For over 5,000 years, humanity has worshipped at a single universal altar. It didn't matter if you were a Roman emperor, a medieval king, a Wall Street banker, or a terrified citizen trying to protect your family's life savings. The religion was gold. We called it the ultimate safe haven, the god pillar of economics, the one indestructible asset that would stand tall when the banks collapsed, when the fiat currencies burned into hyperinflationary dust, and when the governments of the world inevitably defaulted on their unpayable debts. We told ourselves, generation after generation, that gold was the absolute truth in a world of financial lies. We were wrong. We were catastrophically, heartbreakingly wrong. Just 72 hours ago, an internal, heavily redacted dossier from the World Bank was leaked to a consortium of independent financial analysts. What this document contains is not a forecast, not a probability, but a mathematical death sentence for the global middle class. The World Bank is predicting, and actively preparing for, a catastrophic 80% global wealth wipeout. And at the absolute dark epicenter of this financial apocalypse is the deadliest, most violent gold price crash in the recorded history of human civilization. If you think you are safe because you hold physical bullion buried in your backyard, or because you possess shares in a major gold ETF, you are standing on the tracks, staring blindly at the headlights of an oncoming train. Let me ask you a question, and I want you to really think about it. What does an 80% wealth wipeout actually mean? It is a number so staggeringly large, so fundamentally destructive, that the human brain naturally tries to reject it as science fiction. It means that if you have $100,000 in total net worth today, your savings, your retirement accounts, the equity in your home, and your precious metals, tomorrow you wake up and your purchasing power is $20,000. But the cost of surviving has not dropped. The price of bread, the cost of the electricity keeping your lights on, the price of the gasoline in your car, these have not crashed. In fact, they have skyrocketed. This is what the elite central bankers refer to in their sterile, air-conditioned boardroom meetings as the Great Compression. It is the systematic, intentional evaporation of your financial sovereignty. And the trap that caught the most cautious, the most prepared individuals, was the golden trap. For decades, the financial establishment, paired with alternative media doomsday preppers, shouted a unified message from the rooftops: buy gold. They told you it was the only asset that could never go to zero. And for a very long time, the charts validated their promises. Look back at the crises of our past. Look at the dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, the Lehman Brothers collapse and the great financial crisis of 2008, the unprecedented global lockdowns of 2020, and the rampant, unchecked inflation of 2024 and 2025. Every single time the system shook, the price of gold ticked upward. We watched it surge past $2,000, then $3,000, then an astonishing $3,500 an ounce. It was a fever. People were liquidating their children's college funds, taking out second mortgages on their homes, and cashing in their pensions to buy gold bars. We watched as central banks in the East, the BRICS nations, China, Russia, India, hoarded thousands of tons of the yellow metal deep within heavily guarded subterranean vaults. They were preparing for war, we thought. They were preparing to back a new global currency with physical commodities, we assumed. But there is a ruthless law of nature that applies equally to physics and to financial markets. The higher, faster, and more parabolic the climb, the more violently devastating the eventual fall. The illusion of intrinsic value is the most dangerous psychological weapon ever wielded against the working class. The mechanism of this deadly crash is something that will be studied in economics textbooks for a century, assuming we still have an economy left to study. Let us pull back the curtain and look at the anatomy of the slaughter. In the early months of 2026, the global economy had finally hit the terminal velocity of its debt spiral. We were living in a hollowed-out ghost economy, propped up entirely by synthesized liquidity and the issuance of green energy bonds that carried yields no sovereign nation could ever actually pay. When the inevitable liquidity crisis hit, triggered by the synchronized default of 3 major European sovereign debt markets, the entire world panicked simultaneously. They reached for the ripcord. They reached for their gold. But when they pulled the cord, nothing happened. The parachute was gone. Why? Because of a quiet, insidious, and perfectly executed geopolitical chess move by the Western financial hegemony. For years, the BRICS nations had been openly threatening the supremacy of the US dollar, teasing the release of a gold-backed trade note. The Western central banking cartel realized that to save their fiat system, they didn't need to outlaw gold as Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in 1933. They simply needed to destroy its liquidity. They weaponized the derivatives market. They flooded the global exchanges with tens of trillions of dollars of paper gold, unbacked, highly leveraged futures contracts that artificially diluted the physical market by a ratio of 400 to 1. At the exact same moment, the Bank for International Settlements coordinated the simultaneous, mandatory rollout of the Global Central Bank Digital Currency Framework, the CBDC network. Suddenly, physical gold was completely decapitalized. The new digital financial grid was designed with strict algorithmic anti-money laundering protocols that specifically flagged, heavily taxed, or outright blocked the conversion of physical precious metals into digital credits. You had the gold, but you could not buy groceries with it. You could not pay your property taxes with it. The major bullion dealers were legally gagged, and their banking lines of credit were severed overnight. The market didn't just drop, it froze completely solid. Let us look at the underlying mathematics, because numbers do not lie, even when politicians do. The pricing model for this collapse can be understood through a chillingly simple equation. PG equals DM LS times 1 minus phi. In this model, PG represents the realized market price of gold. LS stands for the available systemic liquidity, the actual tangible cash in the system willing to buy. DM is the demand for physical delivery. But the true killer in this equation is the variable phi, which represents the algorithmic manipulation and regulatory friction factor. In March of 2026, as the digital currency mandates took effect, phi was driven functionally to its absolute maximum limit. The systemic liquidity, LS, evaporated instantly as institutions faced the mother of all margin calls. When the global stock markets plummeted by a staggering 60% in a matter of weeks, massive hedge funds, sovereign wealth portfolios, and institutional investors were violently forced to liquidate their most reliable assets to cover their catastrophic derivative losses. Gold was the only thing left on their balance sheets with any remaining perceived value, so the algorithms triggered. They sold. They sold thousands of tons of paper contracts in microseconds. It was a terrifying, relentless cascade. It was a flash crash that didn't just last for a chaotic 20 minutes. It lasted for agonizing, soul-crushing months. The price of gold plummeted from its all-time high of roughly $3,800, violently smashing through support levels at $2,000, bleeding down to $1,500, and finally capitulating at a nauseating $700 an ounce. But remember, the spot price didn't even matter, because the spread between the paper price and the physical reality was completely broken. Even at $700, there were no buyers. The bid had simply vanished from the earth. This brings us to the human cost, the visceral, bleeding reality that the sociopaths in Washington, London, and Geneva refuse to acknowledge. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah is a loyal subscriber to Aurex, a member of our family. She is 64 years old, a retired school teacher living in a quiet suburb in the American Midwest. She wrote to me just days ago, and her words have been haunting my sleep ever since. Sarah did everything right according to the traditional rules of the game. She watched the mainstream news anchors, the polished men in their expensive suits, confidently declaring that physical gold was the ultimate hedge against the rampant inflation that was eating away at her pension. Terrified of losing her independence, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She liquidated her entire 401k, cheerfully paid the massive early withdrawal penalties, and converted her life's work into heavy, shining gold bars. She hid them in a floor safe. She told me she finally felt a sense of profound peace. She thought she had built an impenetrable fortress around her retirement. She thought she had outsmarted the corrupt bankers. When the 2026 crash hit and the value of her fortress collapsed by 80% in a fortnight, she didn't panic immediately. She remembered the mantra, hold the line, its intrinsic value. But then her utility bills tripled. Her property taxes were reassessed under the new emergency municipal guidelines. She needed cash. Sarah drove to her trusted local coin dealer, a man she had known for a decade. She found the storefront shuttered, heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, a hastily scrawled note taped to the glass apologizing, stating that their bank accounts had been frozen by the federal regulators. She went home, trembling, and logged onto the massive online bullion exchanges. The interfaces were active, the charts were flashing deep red, but the sell buttons were grayed out, disabled, suspended indefinitely due to unprecedented market volatility. Sarah sat on her living room floor, surrounded by 10 pounds of the most historically coveted metal on planet Earth. She looked into the camera of her phone as she recorded her message to me, tears streaming down her face. She said, "John, I am holding a king's ransom in my hands, and I cannot buy my heart medication. I cannot pay the electric company. I am a millionaire on a piece of paper printed in 2025, but today, right now, in 2026, I am a beggar starving to death on a pile of treasure." This is the human touch that the architects of the Great Reset will never factor into their pristine, sanitized spreadsheet models. They talk endlessly on financial networks about systemic deleveraging, portfolio rebalancing, and necessary macroeconomic corrections. They never, ever talk about Sarah. They never talk about David, a 35-year-old father of 3 who put his entire small business loan into gold ETFs to protect his company's capital from currency debasement, only to discover that the prospectus allowed the fund managers to settle his shares in depreciating fiat currency instead of physical metal during a liquidity event. David lost his business, his employees lost their livelihoods, and his children lost their future, all legally executed under paragraph 7, subsection C of a contract nobody ever reads. The safe investment became a financial noose, meticulously tied and handed to the working class. You must understand why the mainstream media will absolutely refuse to cover the mechanics of this wipeout honestly. You will never hear the truth on the major cable networks, because those networks are owned, funded, and entirely controlled by the very institutional asset managers who engineered the crisis. They are the ones who desperately needed you to stay trapped in the burning building just a little bit longer, just until they had safely moved their own capital out through the back door. They needed exit liquidity. In the brutal zero-sum game of global finance, for a billionaire to sell at the top, a terrified retail investor must be convinced to buy at the top. When the talking heads looked into the camera in 2025 and told you to hold, it was because their parent companies were aggressively selling. When they published glossy magazine articles declaring that gold was the undeniable currency of the future, it was specifically because they needed a massive, gullible audience to dump their toxic, over-leveraged paper gold contracts onto before the World Bank's engineered 80% wipeout officially commenced. They played on your primal, historical instincts. They knew that human beings possess a deep psychological vulnerability regarding gold. It shines. It has weight. It feels like real wealth. They weaponized our history against us. The transition into the new digital economy required the total destruction of the old physical economy's safety nets. If you had the ability to opt out of their central bank digital currency by transacting in gold, you possessed a dangerous level of freedom. And in 2026, financial freedom was quietly classified as an existential threat to the state. The new wealth taxes introduced in the emergency sessions of early 2026 specifically targeted the holders of physical precious metals. They demanded audits. They required serial number registration for bullion under the guise of combating domestic terrorism and tax evasion. The World Bank did not simply possess a crystal ball that allowed them to predict this catastrophic crash. They possessed the geopolitical influence to actively orchestrate the conditions that made the crash a mathematical certainty. So, we find ourselves standing in the wreckage, staring at a future that looks vastly different from anything our parents or grandparents could have ever prepared us for. Where do we go from here? Is all hope entirely lost? Are we destined to simply become compliant serfs in this new, hyper-surveilled digital barony? No, absolutely not. But you must radically and immediately change the way you perceive value. The old rules of wealth preservation are dead and buried under the rubble of the 2026 crash. If you want to survive the coming years, if you want to shield your family from the ongoing shockwaves of this 80% wipeout, you have to stop thinking like a wealthy collector hoarding shiny rocks in a dark safe, and you must start thinking like a sovereign individual. The concept of wealth must transition from the physical accumulation of precious metals to the mastery of utility wealth. In a world where financial markets can be paused with the flick of a switch, where liquidity can vanish in milliseconds, true value retreats to that which directly sustains human life and autonomy. Productive, arable land that can yield food regardless of what the stock market does. Independent, off-grid energy generation systems that keep your home functioning when the municipal grid inevitably fails or is rationed. Access to clean, uncontaminated water. Most importantly, the accumulation of highly specialized, irreplaceable mechanical and agricultural skills. A man who knows how to repair a solar inverter or purify a water source holds infinitely more leverage in the 2026 economy than a man holding a master box of silver eagles he cannot legally trade. Beyond tangible assets, the most critical evolution you must undergo is recognizing the absolute supremacy of social capital. The greatest, most resilient asset you will ever possess is not locked inside a bank vault. It is the physical network of trusted, capable individuals living around you. In the terrifying vacuum left by the great wealth wipeout, localized community barter systems, mutual aid networks, and deep interpersonal trust will become the only currency that cannot be algorithmically crashed, heavily taxed, or entirely confiscated by a desperate, failing government. Your neighbors, your family, your local farmers, they are your true safe haven. I know that hearing this information is deeply unsettling. I know that looking at the reality of the 2026 economic landscape can induce a paralyzing sense of dread. But I want you to remember that ignorance is the only true danger. Knowledge, no matter how terrifying it initially appears, is the ultimate antidote to fear. The very fact that you are still watching this video, that you are absorbing this grim reality instead of scrolling away to mindless entertainment, proves that you are already leaps and bounds ahead of 99% of the global population. You have the courage to look the monster directly in the eyes. You are no longer asleep at the wheel. My incredibly loyal subscribers, the Aurex family, I am speaking directly to your hearts right now. You are the sole reason I sit in this chair. Every single sleepless night I spend poring over redacted institutional documents. Every piece of hate mail I receive from the financial establishment. Every risk I take by turning on this camera and exposing the machinations of the elite. It is all for you. We are navigating the darkest financial storm in human history. And in this storm, this community is the only lighthouse we have. The World Bank can engineer an 80% wipeout. The corrupt market makers can crash the price of gold into the dirt. They can manipulate the algorithms, freeze the bank accounts, and mandate the digital ledgers. But they cannot wipe out the resilience of the human spirit. They cannot short sell our determination to protect our families. And they absolutely cannot take away the truth once you have heard it, understood it, and armed yourself with it. Please, do not let this warning die here. Share this video immediately. Send it to your parents, your children, your friends, and your colleagues. Do not send it to incite panic, but send it to trigger an awakening. The window for meaningful preparation is closing faster than anyone dares to admit, and the powers that be are counting on your silence. Do not let the deadliest crash in history be the tragic end of your family's story. Let it be the harsh, necessary beginning of your true financial awakening. Thank you for your unwavering support. Thank you for your profound love and trust. I will never stop digging, and I will continue to bring you the raw, unfiltered market updates that the elite desperately want to keep hidden in the shadows. Stay incredibly strong, stay fiercely vigilant, and above all else, no matter how cold the world becomes, stay profoundly human. I love you all. I am John A.G. This is Aurex.